We're off then.
Yep.
Okay, Battle of the Boyne, 1690. This was one of the most important battles in the history of the British Isles, rating with Waterloo, Trafalgar, and the other great battles. I'm not going to talk about the battle yet. I'll lead into it. I want to go back a bit to the start of the 6 afoot with the Dutch forces. I like to say straight away, I'm not an expert in this area. It's out of my comfort zone. I don't normally talk about battles and things before 1800. So there's my excuse. I'll be happy to take criticisms on a £50 note directed to the museum. But here we go. I did start, when I was researching this, I thought I'll read out all the battles in the sort of period 1650 to 1700. But there were so many, I thought that's not a good idea because everybody was fighting everybody else. The Dutch were fighting the English at some stage. They were fighting the Spanish. They were fighting the French. The Danes were fighting the Swedes. The Norwegians and the Danish were fighting the Swedes. The Swedes were fighting the Russians. The French were fighting the Spanish. The Danish were fighting the Spanish. So there's so much going on. There's battles all the time, and Europe seemed to be in permanent turmoil. So what I'll do, I'll start off with uniforms and weapons building up to the Boyne because they played an important part in the battle. First of all, the main weapon of the time was the matchlock. The early matchlocks in the Civil War were so heavy they needed a rest to support them. Roughly 48 inches in length and a 12-bore cartridge or ball, which was quite a big round and a good sort of stopper. It'd make your eyes water. And there were about 30 movements to load and fire, and it took sort of 1 minute. So you're talking about one round a minute. And depending on the regiment, some had 6 ranks in order to give the men time to load and fire. Some had 10 ranks because the men were not that good. An average musketeer would carry 30 or 40 rounds into battle, but you'd obviously have to reload with powder at some stage. And this is one thing you don't see in films. You don't see these barrels of gunpowder behind the men. And this was very dangerous with a matchlock when they're trying to refill their powder flasks and you had burning matches around. The matchlocks have been around for a long time. The variations of it from 1470, but it started to come into service or fade out of service 1720. The rope or match, as you can see, was soaked in potassium nitrate, and someone worked it out that a sentry on duty every night over a year would burn 1 mile of the match. Because the sentries usually burn them at both ends in case anybody crept up and the match had gone out. But also the glow and the smell gave away sentries' positions. So this was another thing against the matchlock. So 1 round a minute, 30 movements, range roughly about 50 to 100 yards, depending on the type of matchlock, and 30 or 40 rounds in battle. But the matchlock was on its way out. Just 3 types of the period. You have the pikeman on the left there. Pikes were very common in the Civil War to keep off cavalry, and the pikemen after the Civil War continued to wear breastplates. Everybody else had abandoned them because a musket ball will go straight through, but the pikemen felt a bit safer with these because they were not normally too mobile on the battlefield, and their job was to protect the musketeers. The musketeer, you can see there with a matchlock and the bandolier with the powder in and a little pouch for the balls. Again, this was a changeover period between the matchlock and the flintlock. The officer there carried a spontoon, sorry, and a sword. When the flintlocks appeared, it meant that officers, very often at their own expense, could buy elaborate pistols and give them a lot more armament. The uniforms were not really practical for battle. One thing the soldiers found very difficult were the shoes. As soon as you got in muddy ground, the shoes would get stuck, and they'd be useless. Very often soldiers would finish a battle in barefoot. Soldiers all look the same, apart from maybe a different colouring. But after a battle, soldiers, if they'd lost a coat or it'd been burnt or blood soaked, they'd pick up another coat and go on to the next battle. So soldiers were very often dressed in a variety of uniforms, and this is why at the Battle of the Boyne, the soldiers were ordered, the Williamites, King Louis, were ordered to have a branch in their hat.
What are you doing?
The French soldiers,
Just military history society.
James's soldiers had a white paper.
Okay.
But there were still instances of where you had a sort of blue on blue, as you call it, soldiers nearly shooting their own men because they couldn't see them in the fog of war, the smoke and the dust. The officers, by the way, the officers could do what they liked with the uniform. There was no real regulation, so depending on their money, they could add nice buttons and lace. And there was no official officer training until 1800. So officers would come along, nice chap, join the regiment, learn as you go. The plug bayonet, 1670, started to appear in the British Army, but the French had tried it in 1647. The French also tried a fixed bayonet built onto the musket. For some reason they didn't like it, so they went back to the plug bayonet. The problem with the plug bayonet was once you fired your round and then plugged it into the end of the barrel, you just had a big pike, really, and very often they would drop out when the men were charging, or if you jabbed it in somebody, you'd pull the musket out and the bayonet would be left in them. So a lot of problems. And the year before the Boyne, at the Battle of Killiecrankie, the Highlanders fighting the English army, they charged at the moment that the soldiers were changing over and trying to plug in their bayonets. So that very short space of time, the Highlanders dropped their muskets, drew their claymores and charged and cut the English to pieces. So people started to have a rethink about the bayonet. But at the Battle of the Boyne, there was a shortage of bayonets on James's side and muskets as well. He had a shortage of everything, really. Right, this is Sir Walter Vann, first Colonel of the 6 a foot. I'll refer to it as the 6 a foot, although it wasn't the title at the time. It was always known by the Colonel, and he was the Colonel for 1 year, but he's probably also the Colonel of the other English regiments in the Danish service. He was born 6th of October 1619. He entered the Dutch service and fought with them against Spain. The reason of fighting Spain had a hold in what is now Belgium. That was the Spanish Netherlands. He commanded all 4 English regiments in 1665 with the rank of Major General, and he was killed at the Battle of Sneffy, I think that's the right pronunciation, the French-Dutch War of 1674. The English regiments in the Dutch service took part in the siege of Grave, 1674. Any notes? This was again in the Spanish Netherlands, today's Belgium, led by the William of Orange, 11th of August to the 9th of October. First of all, the French took it, and then we took it, and the 6 a foot played a prominent part in the storming of Grave. The next colonel, Luke Lillington, 1674 to 1675, dates another 1 year stand. He was a brigadier general, and this is where I think is a mix-up in the regimental history. He's down as Luke Lillington, but in fact he should be Henry Lillington. Luke Lillington was a captain in the army in 1673, a different man. But I think the error has been repeated as each history is rewritten. They just take it as fact. But when I was researching this, I found it should be Henry Lillington. Right. Next colonel, because he was Lillington was only a 1 year stand. Colonel Thomas Ashley, 1675, 1678. Notes back again. He was present at the siege of Maastricht and the Battle of Mont Cassel. Right, the flintlock. The flintlock enters service about 1675, although earlier types are known from 1600, and the French experimented with flintlocks in 1640. And the Birmingham Proof House have a flintlock which was self-loading. It had small charges in the butt, and each time you pulled the lever, a new charge went into the muzzle of the musket. But it was handmade, too expensive to make, and as every soldier knows, your weapon is made by the cheapest bidder. And all these other ideas that were tried, the wheel lock and everything else, they were all too complicated or too expensive for a soldier. So the flintlock, the simple flintlock, was a good soldier's weapon, and improved the accuracy and the time it took to load. They're all handmade. There was no mass production, so if you fitted a new part, you had to sort of mess about with it to make it fit, because each part was slightly different. The rate of fire was upped to 2 to 3 rounds a minute, and the range 100 yards, which was better than the 50 yards out of the matchlock. And again, this played a significant part in the Battle of the Boyne, because we outranged most of James's forces. Many variations in the flintlock, and it lasted about 100 years. And the terms that have come into the English language because the flintlock and the matchlock: bite the bullet. This comes from when musketeers used to carry 3 or 4 bullets in their mouth in order to speed up the loading, plus the fact they could spit the bullet into the barrel and give it a bit of lubrication. The flash in the pan meant when the charge in the pan was fired, but not the main charge, which today means, you know, it's a waste of time or nothing happened. Going off half cock, a similar thing. The weapon's not fully cocked and it goes off in a half cock position, so that means going off too early or whatever. Skinflint, when the flintlocks came in, the soldiers had to pay for the flints. You know, another good money maker for the quartermaster. So the old soldiers used to try and save the old flint and make as much use as possible of it. But of course, it was a bit dangerous because you're risking a misfire or the flint breaking in action. Burning at both ends, we all know from burning the both ends of the candle, but it also applied to the matchlock. If you're burning your matchlock rope at both ends, then it's obviously going to use up faster. And this was a tremendous supply problem as well, because not only did you have to supply musket balls, powder, but you had to supply this burning fuse or fuse for specially treated for the matchlocks. Siege of Maastricht, get it right. Taken by the French and recaptured by William of Orange. Again, in the Spanish, this is the Spanish Netherlands again. The French had paid Sweden to remain neutral in this one. And the French used the trench system well known to us in the First World War for the first time, when they besieged the city initially. and they had a system of interlocking trenches with what we would call reserve trenches and communication trenches. And they roped in 20,000 local farmers against their will to dig all these trenches. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of farmers in that area. The 6 afoot played a key part in the storming of this, and so did the other English regiments. And King William was so pleased with them, well, the survivors, because they took severe losses, he gave them a fat ox and 6 sheep, which the other regiments didn't really like, as they'd been singled out, but they were given that because of their gallantry. I'm sure they'd rather have a fat ox and 6 sheep than a medal. Capture of Cambrai and Valencia and St. Omer, under siege by the French again. There's lots of sieges going on, and most of the cities at that time had all these fortifications in place. And William was sent to relieve Cambrai and Valencia. Cambrai was captured, Cambrai was given to the French in 1678 at the Treaty of Nijmegen. So, as well as all these battles going on, there was lots of border changes as well. The Grenade, 1678, we give it as the date it arrived in the sort of British Army, but there's no doubt there was lots of types around dating way back to the Chinese. And it started the British Army in 1678, and the first people to use it were the Horse Grenadiers, which later became the Life Guards. The Horse Grenadiers fought at the Battle of the Boyne. The Infantry Grenadiers, which were starting to be phased in now. The tall men, strong men were picked for this job because they also had the job of leading assaults with axes to batter down the doors or barricades. 6 men per company was the accepted number. I don't know if the 6 afoot had grenadiers at the Boyne. I know there are other grenadiers in use. From the Danish part, the Danish grenadiers carried their commander across the Boyne so he wouldn't get his feet wet. So that was a mention of grenadiers. But also, if you did away with the pikemen, who formed 1/5 of a company, then you had an extra 1/5 musketeers. So that again increased the firepower at the Boyne. And the Danish didn't have any pikemen, they'd got musketeers. Sir Henry Belsae, I think that's pronounced right, 1678, 1689, born 1648 in County Durham. He joined William's forces in 1674 and was regarded as a good soldier with a number of senior commands. He was Governor of Berwick-on-Tweed, 1714, became a Member of Parliament, died the same year in 1717, and buried in Westminster Abbey. The English regiments in Dutch service, this is what the 6 afoot would have looked like in the Dutch service. I think the coat on the left is a sort of more the ceremonial coat with a nice orange or gold piping and the blue jacket and the cipher on the back. Again, this man's a musketeer. He hasn't changed to the flintlock. But one of the things William did when he took over these regiments, he started to equip them with a flintlock and also improved the provisions and the general support for them, because up until then, there've been all sorts of rogues, as you get in the trade, supplying inferior goods or not supplying at all. The French take Ghent and Ypres and involved in an attack on Abbey of St. Denis, heavy losses, and the French and Dutch sign a peace treaty at Nijmegen. Now, there was lots of other people involved in this peace treaty, and it went on for over a year, but the French were still fighting at times. And you had the Dutch, Spanish, the Brandenburgers, Swedes, Denmark, Munster, and the Holy Roman Empire. And there was something like 100 sub-treaties, but it didn't last. That medal, by the way, they turn up every now and again. What was it? About £4,000, that one. But there are cheaper ones. During this short period of peace, they move into garrison duty, but the time was not wasted by the Dutch regiments or Dutch English regiments and the Danes. They started to develop platoon fire with the new flintlock in 3 ranks. Gone are the old 10 ranks of the matchlock, and they started to develop these 3 ranks where advancing, 1 rank firing, and advancing, all the sort of movements with this new weapon. (1686), the paper cartridge came in. There have been, like all these things, variations around since the 14th century. And later versions, they coated them in beeswax, lard, and tallow to give them waterproofing and lubrication for the barrel. But the very basic one, I actually made one of these on a visit to Srivenham. It was just cartridge paper. That's another thing in the English language. This is where it comes from. Cut to a certain specification. You rolled the powder and ball into it, and there was no string or any other attachments. And when you loaded the musket, you just bit the end off, poured the powder in, and the paper helped bind the ball in the weapon. And when you fired, a terrific amount of smoke. This is where all the smoke comes from, the paper and the powder burning, but it speeded up the load. Philip Babington, the next colonel of the regiment, 1680, 1690. He was born 1632 and initially a captain in the Northumberland militia, then came over to Holland and commanded the Dutch Scots Brigade, 1674 to 1688. He was a major at the Battle of Cassel in 1677, and in 1679, at the Battle of St. Denis, he was wounded and prisoner of war. He was made MP for Berwick-on-Tweed, 1690, the year of the Boyne, but he died the same year, aged 57. Next, you can see James II, when he took over, wanted all these English regiments back from Holland. There was a time when Holland was fighting the English, and we had English regiments in the Dutch service, all very confusing. But anyway, James wanted these English regiments back, but they said no, they're mainly Dutch and Protestant, or Dutch or Protestant, so you can't have them back. So that was a number of regiments that James lost. Next, we have Captain Langham of the 6 Foot, who sent over to make a declaration, or to put the declaration to the English people, that King William is willing to come over and take the throne. There was resistance. The regiment sailed for England, and 4 companies of the 6 Foot were captured on the crossing. But by the time they'd landed, the English army had changed sides. They'd all thrown in everything with William. So they then became part of the English army. And this is where they get the 6 Foot from. They're regarded as 6 off the boats, although that wasn't quite true. The precedence of the 6 Foot was given, but they never used that title of 6 until the colonel's name was dropped from the titles in the regiment, and then they reverted to 6 Foot. Protestants of England were so pleased about King William coming over that news was spread from pulpit to pulpit, and this is in Newton Abbot, a memorial to when the local reverend stood up and declared that King William was on his way to defend their religion. Once in England, they settled down to a bit of garrison duty, as you do in once peace. Normally the winter, not much fighting over the winter periods because the difficulty of moving and keeping troops warm and everything else. So they went into garrison duty in the London area, and by September they're in Torbay, Langard Fort, Sheerness, and Dover Castle, and the Tower of London. Now, at this time, there were no proper barracks. It was all modified fortifications, or they used inns, private houses, and estates to house the troops. The first purpose-built barracks in England was built at Berwick-on-Tweed in 1717. During this period, 1690, it was decided they need more recruits, and they recruited 100 men per company, and you had 12 companies per regiment, mixture of musketeers and pikemen, which were slowly being faded out and retrained as musketeers or grenadiers. They crossed to Ireland from Hollylake to Carrifergus, and then the siege of Charlemont. I'll just go back to the recruiting a bit. As far as I can tell, the bounty was 5 shillings for a recruit, which is a lot of money, but it was soon taken off them by very crafty quartermasters, because when you were issued with the kit, on the next inspection, you was always damaged and you were fined a shilling or whatever, till you probably had about a farthing left after you paid your fines. Men were induced to join the forces then by music, martial music, drink, stories of loot and women, or escaping from jail. But there are also many mercenaries from the wars in Europe. So although these are very often called Dutch regiments, they're probably a mixture of mercenaries from Europe. And a follow on from that, the King's Shilling, if you took the King's Shilling, you recruited. So in later years, one way to recruit someone was to drop a shilling in his beer. But when he drank it, say, you've taken the King's Shilling, you're in. And this is why glass bottom tankers were introduced, so you could see if somebody had dropped a shilling in your beer while you went off to the loo. Siege of Charlemont, on our way to the Boyne, March 1690. Charlemont was a fort from 1602 to 1858. It was occupied by the Jacobites, who were short of food and provisions. A relief sort of convoy was allowed into the fort, but they were not allowed out. And this increased the number of people who needed food and provisions. So they eventually starved out by the Count of Schaumburg, and this opened the way to the Boyne. Some companies of the 6 Foot were left behind to garrison the fort, but it was in such a state, it took a while to clean it before they could actually occupy it. Bit about James II now of England, or James VII of Scotland. Born 1635, son of James I. He was with his father at the Battle of Edge Hill in the Civil War. I think he was about 12, 14 at that stage, nearly got captured. He was in charge of the firefighting in the Great Fire of London, 1666. He served in the French army as a captain of an Irish regiment. He also served in the Spanish army as a captain general of the 6 British volunteer regiments against the French. He was High Admiral for the capture of Dutch territory in America. That's when we took over New Amsterdam and called it New York. He was crowned King 1685 and tried to force his divine rights on Parliament, saying, I'm king and you do what I say. he also tried to force the Catholic faith on various institutes in England, which didn't go down well. The army deserted him in 1688 for William. William of Orange, born 1650, he was the nephew and son-in-law of James II. Like all these families of Europe, they're all mixed up, married to each other. It's quite complicated. He was Prince of Orange from birth, and he married Mary, that's James II's daughter, in 1677, and she was aged 15. He took part in many wars against France, also fought with the Spanish and Brandenburgs against the English and France. King of England, Scotland, Ireland, 1689, and he died of pneumonia, complicated from a broken collarbone with a fall from a horse. Now, it's said that the horse fell or put its hoof in a mole hole that caused him to topple from his horse. And I believe the Catholics, I'll be corrected on this, have a little toast to the little man in the velvet jacket, the mole, who caused his horse to topple. Right, the Battle of the Boyne. Get your pencils ready in Ireland. Mistakes. 1st of July, 1690 on the old Julian calendar. James basically promised an Irish Parliament. He promised the return of confiscated lands, but Enniskillen and Derry were against James. So the battle, both forces headed towards the Boyne, but on the 30th of June, the day before, artillery fire started all day. Now, I've read different accounts of the battle, so I'm giving an account that was written probably 150 years ago. King William went to survey the battlefield and sat down, ordered breakfast, and his entourage came up and he had breakfast on the banks of the Boyne. And the Irish artillery thought, well, this is a good target, and brought up their guns. By then, King William was mounted, he was back on his horse when the Irish fired. A cannonball grazed his arm, but didn't sort of do any damage. It was bound up by a nobleman's hanky, which is now believed to be in Hampton Court, Herefordshire. There is another Hampton Court, and it's in Herefordshire. And this hanky is supposedly on show there. I'll have to look next time on there. But anyway, in this initial bombardment, 2 horses are killed, and the Prince of Hesse, I believe, was killed as well. William retired and had a council of war on the tactics for next day. So discussing, it's good for a commander to get all the ideas in, and this is what he talked through. Do we go frontal assault? Do we do this? Do we do that? Anyway, daybreak, 1st of July, the baggage and greatcoats were sent to the rear. And one thing that both sides forgot to do, there's a bridge across Slane. Where are we? Just go back a bit. You see there the figures for the army. Only they reckon 500 casualties for William, 1,500 plus for James, and a whole mixture of troops on William's side. And this is why identification was so important. Right, the battle. The Bridge of Slane wasn't noted initially by both sides. The James's forces should have blown it up so William couldn't cross, and William should have captured it early to make sure he could go across. But anyway, James also never covered the fords with his cannon and cut down hedges which would allow the cavalry to move about. So this is one mistake. First of all, you can see one on the map. A right wing was sent towards the Bridge of Slane, a diversion by Count Merhart von Schomberg, the son of Count von Schomberg, and there was a 1-hour mini battle over this side. Now James thought that this was the main force coming this way, and they were in danger of being encircled in the rear. So he split his forces, which most commanders will know is not a good thing to do, and sent his forces to meet this threat. So there's this battle going on there, and meanwhile William started his main attack across there, across the centre. William's artillery was far superior to James's and better trained. William crossed the river with the right wing of his force. The centre advance of the infantry of Marshal Schomberg. James's engineers had erected, they'd done some defence. They pulled down farm buildings and cottages in the area and formed a barricade on his side of the river. And they did have some cannon and musketeers manning the barricades. The Dutch Guards crossed, which was all, this was the proper Dutch Guards. The 6-foot also had the nickname of the Dutch Guards, but they were not Dutch Guards. The Dutch Guards crossed 10 afoot, sorry, 10 abreast. And the Derry and Escalin cavalry manned the flanks. The Dutch Guards crossed with the muskets held high, and there was wave after wave of infantry behind them, and they're up to their armpits in water at some places. Downstream, the Danish crossed. Remember, the Danes were all practically musketeers, no pikemen manning them, holding them back. James's men were initially hidden by the ground, but then rose up to reveal the full force of their army. But the Dutch Blue Guards in the lead of all the forces presented a formidable sight. And many of James's men didn't have muskets. They had a shortage of bayonets. And many of the men were farmers with just farm implements. So when they're faced by a professional army advancing regardless of the casualties, that's when they started to break away. And they flung away their arms, their colours, and anything else that slowed them down, and started the retreat, as you see there on 4. Marshal Schomberg was killed when rallying the French brigade. Different reports on his age. Some say he was 75, some say he was 95. So he's still an old man to be fighting in a battle. James deserted his army at this stage and earned the title from the Irish army, James the Shit. I was going to say it in Gaelic, but I can't. All the baggage and stores were captured from James's army, so he lost a lot of supplies. Although this wasn't the end of the conflict as well. William promised to establish the Protestant faith England, Ireland and Scotland. It stopped the expansion of France, which the Pope approved of. Actually, there was an agreement with the Pope because the Pope didn't like the King of France. 14,000 Irish troops were returned to France. It's better to return them to France and let them feed them rather than imprison them. William also promised Irish Catholics could keep their land, which didn't last long, like all these promises. And Dublin and Limerick still had to be taken as well. But the final battle, which doesn't get the same publicity, the Battle of Ogrim, if I can pronounce it right, 12th of July the following year. And the 12th of July is regarded as Orange Man's Day. And it was the most bloody battle, apparently, between 5,000 and 7,000 killed. The 6-foot were there, and they took a lot of casualties. But that's overshadowed by the Boyne, but it was a very bloody final end to the Irish army. Now, after the battle, King William presented a gold, 18-karat gold medal to Major Rogers of the Enniskillen irregulars, if you like, the cavalry. He led a sort of sideshow on the Boyne, a diversion attack, a Drogadier, and William decided to give him this medal. And this is how it's named, with Rogers spelt with a J. But it must be the very first gallantry medal ever, named gallantry medal ever awarded. There's only one, as far as I know. And there's a hole in the top of it, and he probably wore it, like they did in those days, with a cord. Very few medals had ribbons, they all worn with a cord. The Grand Orange Lodge of Northern Ireland had replicas made of this medal, and one was presented to Sir Winston Churchill and one presented to Field Marshal Allenbrook. Now, I don't know if there are any more presented, but I should imagine they would have done. After the battle, George, Prince of Hesse, takes over as colonel of the regiment. He was born 1669 at Darmstadt in Germany. He was a field marshal at the age of 23. He obviously had contacts. He served in the Austrian army. He fought the Turks, the French, and the Irish. He was Viceroy of Catalonia in 1698 to 1701, Governor of Gibraltar in 1704, and he was killed at the siege of Barcelona, which the Six of Foot were at, in 1705. So, not a bad career, that. Next, this is the Battle of the Boyne. This is a commemorative medal. These are privately produced and not meant to be worn. But I have seen examples of this medal with holes in the top where a cord would go through and could have been worn. I've also seen one with a medal ribbon bar mounted on the top. So this particular one was worn with a ribbon. But because there's no photographs about at this time, you can't tell if anybody, any old soldier wore them. But they're expensive. You can get Battle of the Boyne medals cheap as £100, and the very good examples up to 6,000. In fact, this one was sold for £6,240, made by a Dutch artist, Jan Ludde. Now, this medal, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne, this medal was made 1790. This is in my collection. And it was worn by soldiers of Orange Lodges in uniform. So it's probably one of the first medals with a ribbon worn by soldiers. But the Orange Lodges were formed 1795. So whether the medal was worn before that, I don't know. Probably when the lodges were formed. The Orange Lodges were formed in the military and civilian lodges, and they're worldwide. A lot of the colonial Orange Lodges in Canada, America, they also formed the local militia because they were loyal to the king. That's the reverse of the medal. The War Office obviously didn't like this rise in Orange Lodges. They didn't ban Masonic lodges. The Six of Foot had a Masonic lodge, but I could find no trace of an Orange Lodge, which is unusual considering their Dutch heritage. But the War Office issued this circular saying, look, we sent a letter out in 1822 and again in 1829, now 1835, and these lodges still haven't been disbanded. So they're basically saying, unless you disband them, or if anybody's found parading in these lodges, they'll be court-martialed. So there's probably lots of Masons in the War Office then that didn't like the Orange Lodges. Battle of the Boyne Memorial, erected in 1736. This is the spot where King Billy's supposed to have had his breakfast. It was blown up by the IRA in 1923. There is a joke going around that the IRA map reading was so bad that they couldn't find it until 1923, but I don't believe that. So some of the stones from this memorial have recently been donated to the Orange Heritage Lodge Museum in Belfast last year. This is a very blurry picture, I'm afraid, but it just shows that this War Office order was ignored, certainly in the First World War. This is a naval lodge in the Royal Navy, an Orange Lodge in the Royal Navy. This is the Loyal Orange Lodge of the 36th Ulster Division. Note the date, June 1916. This is what's left after the Battle of the Somme. So they took a lot of casualties there. But still, they obviously hadn't read the 1835 order. There are other pictures around. After the First World War, our links with Holland were renewed, and our connections with the past, and windows were dedicated to the English regiments in Dutch service, with a big service by the Queen of Holland in 1928. And also the Burgomaster was presented with this very nice inkstand. I've obviously walked past this church hundreds of times. I've been to Amsterdam, and I haven't been in. I didn't realise the location until I was looking this up. It's right in the centre. I was probably too drunk to notice it, but there we are. And as we know, Orange parades, the traditions carried on, the memory of the Battle of the Boyne, you know, saved from the Pope and everything else. And again, so the modern British soldier hasn't read the 1835 order, and this is soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan celebrating the Orange Lodge. Another group there. And of course, any battle site is big business now. And you have the Boyne Visitor Centre at Oldbridge, a little piece of orange in the south. It brings in lots of tourists and lots of Euros. And there's reenactors and all sorts of, I haven't been there, but maybe one day. And to finish off, this is a Northern Ireland General Service Medal, and you think the 6 Foot came onto the English establishment as a result of actions in Ireland, and they sort of faded out with Northern Ireland. When the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers was formed, for a short time, the regiment still kept their number in front, and we all knew that the second RRF was the Royal Warwicks. And for the early tours, 1971, it had the 2 in front. So this is the last medal you can associate with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And Northern Ireland, it's just interesting that they started in Ireland, you could say, and they finished in Ireland. And this man enlisted about 1971. That's it. Thank you very much. Now, any questions or criticisms or facts wrong, I'll come out the share so I can face you. I can look you in the whites of your eyes there.
Dave, can I just ask if you can hear me?
I can't hear.
You can't hear, right.
Somebody's talking. Can you speak up, please?
Yes, Dave, it's Chris Newton. Can I just ask, you showed the 100-year medal, the commemorative medal for the Battle of the Boyne, but it's on a white and yellow ribbon, which are papal colours. Can you explain how
it's faded orange.
Ah, right. Thank you.
And I wasn't going to do a changing of ribbons on it. That's if I could find an orange and white ribbon.
Thanks for that.
quick comment from myself here. I'm married into Northern Ireland, and my wife's from Belfast, so I've spent time over there. Of course, the 12th of July is the day that the Battle of the Boyne is remembered. But as we know, David's explained to us, it was actually on the 1st of July. And it's interesting how the dates got transposed, because of course the Battle of Ockram, as I pronounce it, was the 12th of July. That was the battle that concluded the Williamite Wars over there. The commander of James's forces had his head taken off by a cannonball, which is one way of bringing a battle to an end. And then over time, the dates have got confused. So you talk to most people in Northern Ireland and say the Battle of the Boyne, and they say, oh yes, the 12th of July. But actually it's the 1st of July and so on.
Yeah, the 12th is regarded as Orange Man's Day, I understand. But it's not, that battle's not given any credibility. It's sort of, the Boyne overshadows everything else.
Yes.
But they had to take Derry and they had to take Dublin as well.
And possibly because both monarchs were on the field at the Boyne.
Yeah.
Although James races to Dublin, and I love the story that he arrives in Dublin and is met by some woman who says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "My army have abandoned me. I've been there's treachery. I've been abandoned. I've been let down, and so on. And so I've come here to start again." He says, and she says to him, "Well, it seems that you're all having a race and you seem to have won the race. You're here first before anybody else has got here."
Yeah.
James the ship.
There was one story that William stopped the capture of James because it's better that he went back to France and he stayed there than rather have him as a martyr and imprisoned in England.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised.
David, can I ask you something? You mentioned several ranks, which I was just wondering, how did the hierarchy of the English army get decided? Because you mentioned people were brigadier general, major general, colonel, major. How did they get promoted, or how did they get given the rank?
Well, it was no exams or anything in those days. You could easily go from colonel to general in no time at all, and brigadier general was still an army rank until the end of the First World War, and we dropped the general and called it brigadier. But you had all sorts of queer ranks at that time. But yeah, there was people were promoted in the field, and that was it.
Presumably they had to be moneyed and good leaders, naturally good leaders, I would think. Yeah.
Because I'm sure if the men didn't like them, the first battle they were in, they'd shoot them.
Great talk, by the way. Really enjoyed it.
It's good. Very good.
Did they purchase their commissions, David? Do you know?
I don't think at that stage. No. It was just, being in the right family and everything else. The purchasing came in later. The purchasing, by the way, was the way an officer could retire. That was his pension.
Yeah.
That's the reason, because it wasn't a pension.
Okay. A question from Andrew.
So if you're in a regiment... Sorry?
I'm curious as to whether there was much fighting at sea at the time, because I know that the English built up a formidable army, and I'm guessing they were mainly Williamites. I'm just curious as to whether the Jacobites had any navy and whether they did any fighting at sea.
Yes. There was. I didn't go into the navy one. There was a battle just before the Boyne where William's navy were defeated. So he had that in his mind when he was going to the Boyne. If he lost the land battle and the sea battle, that would be the end of him.
Were they defeated by the Jacobites or by some kind of foreign power?
Well, I think there's a mixture of French. Yes. The French were always mixed in with them.
And Andrew's left a comment, if anyone is interested in the new order that emerged after the battle and what the new rulers did and their eventual downfall, recommend the book Ascendancy to Oblivion by Michael McConville, which is first class. So thank you for that, Andrew. Okay, any other questions? Any other questions?
Can just jump in again with a
Yep.
a kind of I'm sure several people here like me are great enthusiasts for visiting battlefields. I just can't visit enough. Now, when you want to drag your family to see the battlefield of the Boyne, we are rather fortunate in that there's the old bridge, the old very ancient remains of some kind of prehistoric place that predates Stonehenge. And the way you do it is that you go and you park up on the south side of the Boyne, and you get a timed ticket. Well, this was some years ago when we did it, and you get a little tour bus that goes around. So you can combine that with a visit to the visitor centre for the Battle of the Boyne and make quite a nice family day out. So there's a bit of carrot there to get your family along. But the visitor centre was absolutely excellent. I was very impressed with it. So
Good.
Well worth a visit.
Okay, so if there's no more questions.
One question.
Rita, yep.
You had mentioned the bayonets causing problems earlier. Did those cause a significant problem for James when he was retreating in his forces, or was there any particular side that suffered more from the faulty bayonets?
No. So the biggest disaster was the Killiecrankie, when the Highlanders sort of took the opportunity to charge the English forces just at that changeover period. But we had the advantage of, when I say we, William's army had the advantage at the Boyne. They had, every musketeer had a bayonet, whereas in James's army, some didn't even have muskets, and the ones that had muskets didn't all have bayonets. There was a shortage of, and all this makes a big difference to the firepower. It meant with the Danes and the English regiments with flintlocks, they could fire before the James's army were in range.
Okay, right. Well, just to thank David very much for his really interesting talk on an area I'm not that familiar with, but very interesting. Of course, the British Army then went on to be shaped by Marlborough and to be world-beating in that respect, but a fascinating insight into the early history of the 6th Regiment of Foot. And if I was ever going to do a PhD, which I'm probably not, but I think I would do it on horse grenadiers, cavalry throwing grenades. I think that must be a fascinating subject. And also we come across many military maxims at these talks. And I think one military maxim must be, don't have your breakfast within range of enemy guns. But thank you very much, David. I know all of us here know how much effort goes into producing a highly entertaining talk like that. So thank you very much. Just to repeat, if you'd like to make a donation, you can do it using the museum website. If you'd like to join the Friends, then details are on the museum website as well. And of course, we're doing this because we all love the Fusilier Museum in Warwick, and details when it will be reopening. Of course, there is a move from one site to another in the offing as well, but details of those move and the opening will be on the website as well. So thank you very much, David, and thank you everybody from attending. And hopefully when I turn on the television briefly, Coventry aren't already a goal down. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.